There is concern the incident will disrupt global supply chains of everything from oil to cars and now perhaps even instant coffee. Bloomberg senior commodities reporter Isis Almeida joins us now to explain. Isis, thank you for speaking with us. Let's talk about the effect on the price of coffee in financial markets. What's going on with Robusta futures here?
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, we've seen a pretty big reaction in Robusta futures today. We saw the price go up 2.8%, and it was rebounding from a two-week low. And all of it is because of this concern on the Suez Canal. Pretty much all of the Robusta coffee that supplies Europe leaves from East Africa and Asia, and it goes through the Suez Canal. There's really only two countries that don't use that route. That being Ivory Coast and Brazil. So the reaction in the market today was pretty impressive.
Right, and it'll likely continue next week if this logjam continues, which it is expected to do. Talk a little bit about how there was already a shortage of Robusta that was produced by Vietnam even before this Suez Canal blockage, and that's kind of exacerbated everything.
That's right. I mean, we are already facing a shortage of containers globally, and a lot of people ask, why is that the case? I think it's based in, the Chinese economy recovered much faster than the others, and they're starting exporting a lot. And bored people like you and me in Europe and the U.S. started just ordering everything online. So that stocked up a lot of containers and created a shortage of containers in certain places in the world. And Vietnam, the world's largest Robusta producer, was one of these places that was struggling to get containers. So the coffee roasters that rely on Vietnamese supply were already without some of the normal flows. And then when the Suez Canal issue hit, it was just one more headache.
Yeah, and coffee is serious business over in Europe. So those coffee roasters, they can't get their Robusta from Vietnam. They've turned increasingly to East Africa. What about Brazil, which is, of course, a huge coffee producer?
That's right. And when it comes to Robusta, Brazil is actually the second largest. But in Europe, I think it's because of taste. Historically, the European roasters have favored Vietnamese supply. And when they cannot get it, the best substitute for them to keep the product tasting exactly the same for consumers like you and me is really replacing with East Africa, from places like Uganda. But now these East African coffees also goes via the Suez. So you have another problem there. Replacing with Brazil is just a little trickier for the European roasters because in the end, it could result in a change in the taste of the coffee that you and I buy in the supermarket. And that's not their preference.
Yeah, that would send ripples through their customer base. I mean, think of how many people rely on their morning cup of coffee, and if you start changing the taste, I mean, people are going to freak out. Let's talk a little bit here about how prices in the futures market, the financials market, have increased because of the logjam. What about the beans that are already in place, that are stored in European warehouses? What kind of effect has that had on the physical price there?
I think that's very interesting because, the futures are reacting just now. But when the container shortage first hit Vietnam at the end of last year and, European roasters started looking around for supplies of Vietnam or supplies of coffee from Uganda, for instance, the traders that had those in hand, they didn't have a lot of it, but they had an opportunity to sell at so much higher price is so much higher than in the futures market. So we saw a situation at the height of the container shortage prices in which some of the traders were offering Vietnamese coffee stored in European warehouses at a premium of $450 a ton to the futures market. And that's like about 3 times the regular price. So I think the traders that found themselves with those beans in their hands probably did very well.
Yeah. To what extent are we going to see this show up immediately in the prices that consumers have to pay for their coffee in Europe?
Normally, every roasters have stock and they have coverage of like 6 to 9 months. So you don't see the prices in the supermarket fluctuate in the same way you see the futures market. I think the consumers would be pretty upset if that was the case. So for a price increase in the physical market, and in the futures market to be passed on to consumers, it will take I would say 6 to 9 months because that's kind of what the roasters have. And they have to see an increased problem and increased prices throughout that period for them to make a decision and say, hey, I'm going to charge my consumer more. Because can you imagine going to the supermarket and your coffee costs X today and X plus 2 and then X plus 3 the next day. So consumers don't take that very well. So it's a big, big decision for roasters to actually increase prices to consumers.
Right. They'll do that as kind of a last resort. Isis, thank you so much for explaining that, because when we talk about how coffee prices, and here we're talking about in the financial markets, surge, everyone immediately assumes that means they're going to pay more out of pocket as well.
The biggest stories the moment they happen from around the globe. Subscribe to Bloomberg Quick Take now for insight in an instant.